started.
Okay. Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. Today, we're talking about the SCCE CEI, what we learned and what's next. For those of you who are joining us, my name is Eric Morehead. I am the Director of Advisory Services at LRN, where we work to help organizations shape their compliance program, work on their code of conduct and other policies, and just help out with any other projects that are not training related on the other side of the house for LRN. We wanted to have this webinar again, as we did last year, to talk a little bit about lessons learned from this year's SCCE annual event, and have a conversation about the different trends that we might have seen, trends that have disappeared, and other goings on at the annual event. For those of you who have questions, please, throughout the session, feel free to enter those into the Q&A box. I'm going to be tracking that, and as you ask your questions, I'll interject with our panel and make sure that your questions get answered. And we also are going to do one polling question, which we'll pose here in just a second, and then have a short survey at the end of the session. So the polling question actually just popped up for everyone there. And it's basically, we just want to get a sense from all of you in the audience whether you actually attended SCCE CEI this year. There's now 2 ways you can attend, both in person and virtually, and we just want to get a sense from our audience out there who attended and how you attended this year. Also, as I mentioned, at the end, we'll have a short survey. So if you have a few minutes at the end of our session, please take a moment to do that. This session is being recorded, so if you want to listen to it later, or you want to tell some colleagues about the part of the conversation that we have in the next hour, it will be available on our website later. But I need to introduce our excellent panel that we have this year to talk about the conference and their takeaways. First, Beth Lentini Walker is the Assistant General Counsel of Marqeta, founder of Lumen Worldwide Endeavors, and also a board member of our favorite organization, SCCE. We also are joined today with Adam Balfour, General Counsel and VP for Corporate Compliance and VP for Global Risk Management at Bridgestone Americas. Both of you, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So thank you for the lovely introduction.
And, we might as well jump right in. Both of you, I think, or similar to me, have been to the SCCE event for many years. I think this was my 11th SCCE event that I've, I think going all the way back to 2010. So I know that both of you have gone to the event over the years and seen the changes, both most recently, there have been some significant changes over the last couple of years, but also over time, the profession has changed, and so has SCCE. But overall, just get both of y'all's impression on the event this year. What's changed in just this last year, last couple of iterations of the event, and how would you compare the conference this year compared to last year?
You want to go first, Adam?
Sure, I'll kick it off. I suspect I'm probably the rookie of the group. I think this was actually only my 5th, maybe 6th time, but I think it was really the only 5th time that I've attended. So definitely over the years, it's changed from, I always enjoy when it's in Vegas. Then, one year I think it was just outside DC, and then of course in the dark years of COVID, we did that fully remote version. I thought this version was good. I enjoyed it. I was there in person, and I liked it. I think it was great. Just the energy this year. I think last year it was a little bit of uncertainty. Everybody was wearing the wristbands for, your comfort level, for hugging, for staying away. We just had to wear face masks. And I thought this year it just felt much more, the excitement was there. I thought it was a great venue. First time for me actually visiting Phoenix or Arizona, so that was a kind of a perk for me as well. But I thought it was just nice to get back and see a lot of people. And actually, some people, I feel like actually Lisa, Beth, and Eric, I feel like I hardly saw both of you in Phoenix. So that was one of the great things. A lot more people, but one of the downsides, I felt like actually I didn't have as many connections with some people that I wanted to. So glad we get a chance today to chat and share our thoughts and experiences.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what you said. Like there was a palpable energy in the room that felt really good. Or in the many rooms, because there were quite a few rooms. Compared to last year, you're right. It was in Vegas. It was kind of a first outing for many people, and we were still very much in the thick of the COVID times, and so there was, I think, a lot more reticence just in terms of attendance and proximity to people. We had more spacing in Las Vegas than in Phoenix, but what was really interesting was that I think there were more vendors this year that were there for the exhibit hall, the volume of people that were attending, and people had lots of different approaches to attendance, whether they were masking, not, etc. There was kind of a place and a space for everyone at their own comfort level, which was really nice to see. And I thought it was really interesting that there was both a in-person and an virtual version. The virtual version wasn't the full spectrum of the conference, because there were a lot more sessions that were not put into the virtual realm, but it was a really good representation of the type of experience and the type of level of discussion, professionalism, the expertise that was on display. So these were all, I thought that the conference went really well. I liked trying a different venue because I had never been to a conference in Arizona either. And so this was a new place for me. And also, I think there were more tracks, certainly more tracks than last year, but lots more topics, because I think in general, we're seeing our profession being called to do many more things, whether it's, overseeing third-party risk or risk management in general or ESG. There's just all of these different topics as the profession and the people in it continue to grow and develop. So for me, it was really a fantastic experience.
Yeah, I echo that too, that it was really different from last year. I mean, last year it was live, but it was very, like a lot of events, I'm sure, on the heels of COVID, it was still very different and very subdued and not as well attended. We got the results from our little informal poll here with our participants, and it looks like just a little over two to one of the people who attended live, but a good 10% of the people participating today were virtual participants. And that kind of I guess what was maybe shouldn't have been surprising to me, but I noted in several of the sessions, including some of the larger sessions, that there was a huge virtual component to those sessions, which I think reflects in kind of the breakdown of the percentage of people who attended in our group here too, is that it was pretty significant. I don't know if we have overall numbers of what the virtual participation was versus the live participation. No, it wasn't probably as great as the live participation, but I think it was pretty significant. And to me, that kind of tells me that maybe this is permanent, or at least not something that was just a one-off for last year, for the years where we had the more severe restrictions because of the coronavirus. It seems to me that maybe this virtual participation is a long-term thing. I don't know. But most of the sessions I participated in, except the one that I led a session, but it was one of the ones that Lisa Beth mentioned. Some of them weren't virtual, so I didn't have the opportunity to do this. But the ones that were virtual, I was really impressed with the speakers getting participation from the virtual attendees as well. So answering their questions, making sure that they were integrating the virtual attendees into the session as much as possible. So I think this may be just a permanent fixture as we move forward. Maybe this is the way it's going to be. Is we're going to have virtual and live from now on.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice touch that each of the different sessions, the presenters had an iPad, and so that gave you, access to the online audience. I must admit, for one of my sessions, I would just take questions from the room and be like, "Oh, you need to go up to the microphone." So that was something I was a really bad habit of mine. That definitely, I think this is probably going to be how it is. I think going forward for the next few years, and it makes sense, right? As we're looming recession, what are travel budgets going to be like and development budgets? I think it's a nice way to keep people coming together. I must admit, I didn't have much crossover. Sounds like maybe both of you were better about kind of using the technology. I kind of had to put my iPad away, otherwise I find I track emails too much. I have the attention span of a goldfish, so I felt that kind of meant that I wasn't engaging with the online crowd just as much.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that's beautiful is that there's so many opportunities for choice on how to consume information. And the SCCE has for many years had a robust virtual lineup of a number of different conferences and events. And so I think it'll be interesting to see, both from the perspective of the speakers as well as the attendees, like what they liked and what they didn't like. I attended some of the virtual sessions, even though I was physically in Phoenix, because between meetings that I had to have virtually for work and everything else, sometimes it just made more sense to start a session where I knew that I could be on time and there, and then immediately go to my call or whatever. So I think that in a world where there's a lot of choices, providing choices to consumers is going to continue to be important.
Yeah. For those of you in the audience, Carol has asked that if you didn't attend, which I think over 60% of you participating today didn't attend, we're kind of interested in the reasons you didn't. Was that budget? Was that just because the schedule didn't work? Because you're a team of one and you don't have time to leave town, or what the reasons might be? We're curious why you didn't attend. Maybe you've never attended SCCE's annual event in the past and just weren't aware that it was possible to attend virtually. But now you know. So that would be kind of interesting to see some of the reasons. Another thing that I found interesting this year, Lisa Beth, you mentioned that it seemed like there were more vendors participating this year than certainly last year, and I think that's true. But as we go into a more virtual or having a dedicated virtual piece, I'm also curious for those people who participate virtually, how they might interact with the vendors, because part of going to the conference is wandering around, not necessarily just talking to vendors, but talking to each other. Like you mentioned, we didn't really get to see. We saw each other like once or twice and said hi and moved on, but a lot of the congregation happens in the exhibit hall. And if you're attending virtually, that's I'm kind of curious how it might develop over the next few years, where there might be more social interaction, if you will, on the virtual platform to kind of fill in those gaps, because that's one thing that you do miss beyond just physically being in the sessions, is in the hallways and in the exhibit hall, you don't get to see everybody. Both of you had mentioned going to a couple of the sessions and how they were handled. What sessions in particular stood out to you guys this year? I know I have a couple that I really enjoyed, but I'm curious which ones are kind of staying with you after the event.
So I have to say, I feel like the way that the main session started out with the first keynote on the re-entry phenomenon, which was by a physician from Harvard Medical School, I thought that was the perfect way to set the tone for all of the things that were to come. You know, I have a personal affinity for talking about well-being, simply because I think it's something that can't be talked about enough for those people who are in these guardian professions where there's a lot of work that doesn't necessarily get noticed, the thankless work, the many hours. And I personally always am mindful that, you know, burnout is a real thing. And if we are asking people to be at their ethical best, they have to be able to feel like they're doing well and being well as a human being. And so I really loved that it set the tone for that. I really loved the messaging about, you know, being a caring community, about practicing gratitude, about all of these different things. And then there were some amazing presentations by so many people. I mean, obviously, Eric, your presentation was fantastic. Adam's, like, I mean, Adam, all of your presentations are always phenomenal. But there were, you know, great speakers literally from all over the world, from Europe, from South Africa, from, you know, New Zealand, from like literally everywhere. Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, etc. The breadth and depth of the diversity within our profession was on full display in a very supportive way. So that's what I would say like really stood out to me. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, I do regularly quote Lisa Beth. You said probably a year or so, like self-care is not selfish. And I'm like, it is so true. And I think you know, with your outlook, and also I did with the opening keynote, I think it's a good reminder that we are not in the rules business, right? I think that's probably the terrible branding of ethics and compliance is everybody thinks it's about rules and regulations and fines. We're in the people business, right? It's how do we get people to comply with those rules or to comply with those, whether they're laws or internal policies. And I think so much of that, just looking at what people have been through the last few years, incredibly challenging years. There was during one of my sessions where I kind of referred to that the quote that the Lenin quote from years ago about there's decades where nothing happens and then weeks where decades happen. And the last few years, we've had several weeks where decades have happened. And so I did think the opening event was good. I actually arrived to Phoenix on the Monday morning. So I joined that session on my phone a little bit late. And at the point at which I joined, I was waiting for my bag. I was texting Michelle, my wife, to see how the kids were. I was checking my email and I was trying to listen to the session. And then she starts talking about multitasking. And I was like, oh yeah, this is like a great moment of we can't multitask, right? We are not computers. And I had a conversation with someone over lunch one day. It's divided attention is what we should call it, because that really is what it was. And I wasn't paying attention to the bags going around. I wasn't paying attention to my emails. I wasn't excelling at any of those things, but I was trying to do that. And I just thought it set a really nice tone for the rest of the events. And I thought that you know, a lot of the people in our profession who are great speakers from all over the world, different backgrounds, I heard a lot of human stories, and I really like that in the different events that I heard. And I actually felt this one, there's definitely, compared to many years ago, the first time I went to CEI, I was just overwhelmed in a sense. I was like, there's 8 or 9 sessions going on at one time. Some of them are like, I want to attend all 5. I can't pick. And over the years, there's been someone like, well, maybe I'll go to this one, or maybe there's none of them at any given time that really appeal. But I will say this year, there was only one that I attended that I wasn't wowed by. There was a comment that you can become an expert in ESG in about 40 hours. It's like that person and I have very different definitions of the word expert, but I felt the rest of them were really good sessions that I thought were thoughtful. They were complete. And some of the themes that I did like, and I would like to see more of, I thought there was some good conversations around data analytics. I think we're seeing more of that coming from a regulator perspective. We've just seen Matt Galvin join the DOJ, which I think is a really, really interesting, incredibly impressive hire by the DOJ. And so there were some really good sessions. I thought I really liked Mary Shirley, her session she did with Kirsten and someone else whose name I'm blanking. I'm so sorry. And then Andrew McBride, I heard him give a similar talk last year. And a former colleague of mine who I saw actually there made a similar comment to Andrew that I made last year of, Andrew is like a robot from the future, right? He's like Terminator. He is living 10 years in the future with what he's doing with data analytics. And I think just broke it down in a way that inspired the audience to really see this is possible, right? This is what regulators want, but you can do this. Same with some root cause analysis. So lots of, I thought, really good sessions that you could kind of pick and choose from and really kind of build your own journey and your own story as to what you wanted to learn.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And, going back to the keynote really setting the tone, I think what I see with a lot of the clients that I work with is this tension between compliance and maybe HR and some of the other some of the other parts of the organization that are dealing more directly with the workforce and the business side of the organization wanting to just go back to the way things were. And there's this recognition, or should be a recognition within compliance and again, HR and some of these other functions that have to deal with these issues, that we're not going back in a lot of regards to the way things were before 2020. And that thread, I think, went through a lot of the sessions, not just the keynote, that COVID is not gone. Even if we all stopped getting COVID tomorrow, which is not going to happen, the effects of COVID are not gone, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. And although I think there's a portion of the population who just kind of want to wish it away, and we have to deal with that too, right? That's part of another aspect of how we effectively work within our organizations, is understand that some people have that perspective too. But just as we were talking about how SCCE has become a hybrid event, and probably is going to be that, at least for the foreseeable future, there are a lot of people that are going to go back to the office. We hear this day in, day out, but it's really true. That things have changed fundamentally, and compliance officers have to navigate that along with everyone else. And that was to me something that, this session really set the tone, but it really was shot throughout a lot of the discussions throughout the session.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's so true. And I think, I've had conversations over the last few years where understandably people are asking, well, when are we going to go back to normal? And it's a, well, we don't, right? Time only moves in one direction, right? So but I think to me, this is it's the difference between, right, incremental change and transformational change. And, when you wake up today versus tomorrow, things aren't going to be that different, right? But, you think about today and then 10 years from now, it's going to be different, right? You're going to wake up just feeling different, or when you woke up 10 years ago. And so I think what we've seen the last few years is people have just been, physically, emotionally, financially, just pushed outside their comfort zone. And I think what people are really saying is, I want to go back to a place where life feels a little bit more predictable, and I feel like I'm operating on a regular basis in my comfort zone. And I think that's so important for us in ethics and compliance, because we've got to think about the people we're working with, the emotional pressure that they've been under, the challenges they faced, or in this new hybrid way of working. Isolated decision making and pressure, I think, are two recipes for disaster. And so I think we have to lean in, right? We've got to partner with HR and other people, but it's how do we help employees and recognize where they are and where some of those risks might be.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Lisa.
Go ahead. I would agree with you completely, Adam, especially because I think we're in a period of time where at least in the United States, productivity is going down for the first time in a very long time. One of the things that I will be looking at, I believe, in our profession is how do we make working a safe place? How do we make working a comfortable place? How do we make working a predictable place? And we all have a role in that, even if it's not doing management by walking around. We have to think about those techniques to make life more predictable, to like make life more accessible, even if there are people who are not physically within our, arm's length reaching zone. And so I think that there is going to be a lot of effort over the next couple of years in this, what I'll call an adjustment phase, because you're right, we don't go back in time, right? Like we're not going back to the 1940s here. We're not going back to the 1900s. Like we're going to keep our cars. We're going to keep our, not having to make homemade bread every day, things like that. But how do we find that place where people are able to feel a sense of security such that we're able to be more productive? We're able to have that level of emotional, psychological, physical comfort and rest, because we have been going for so long and running on fumes. Like even the mightiest, predator needs rest after periods of extreme exertion. Like we're going to have to address that, and we're going to have to address it in a way that makes it better than it was before.
Yeah. I think that what is amplified by a lot of these topics and this idea is that there's this whole other component beyond the technical. I mean, I think we tend to focus on the technical. Okay, I have remote workers that I need to put together a compliance regime for. So how do I do that technically? How do I, set up monitoring? How do I do training and communication? We tend to think about the technical aspects and not the more holistic piece, which was, I think we all agree was gratifying to see, not only in the keynote, but throughout the sessions.
Yeah, and I think that gives us a really good opportunity. And I think we're at this cusp with ethics and compliance, like almost like how do we move away from, and we've changed this with our program, we no longer use training and communication as a pillar. We actually have moved to learning and engagement. And I think the reason it sounds incredibly subtle, but I think it's a really, really important distinction, that I think training and communication is much more about the intent of compliance. And looking at learning and engagement, I think is looking at that impact on people. And that's where I think we've got to think about it, with Lisa Beth's point about, people are overwhelmed, they're burned out, there's too many priorities, there's 10 number one priorities. I'm like, you can't have 10 number one priorities. There can only be one, but that's the reality that we're facing now. And so I think it kind of gives us an opportunity to see how do we build and rebuild and continuously do so ethics and compliance for where societies and where people are right now. I think there's still so much talk about, the great resignation, the quiet quitting. I actually view it in a different way. I think what we're seeing right now is really the commoditization. I struggle to say that word, but hopefully I got it correctly enough that people understand. But I think it's, a lot of jobs where before you see that brand value, that I think people aren't seeing the brand value. And really, I think what's happening with a lot of jobs is, what's it going to cost me? What are you going to pay me? And what's this job going to cost me emotionally, physically, from a psychological standpoint? This is a great opportunity for companies to lean in and really demonstrate that brand value that they provide. If not, I think it is just going to be, commoditization of jobs is really going to be a challenge for the next few years.
And I would add into what you're saying. I loved your session that you did with Lisa Fine, which is about, keeping it human when it comes to policies. And one of the things we always need, I believe we always need to keep in mind is it's important that we understand what the rules are, but keep it human and keep it humane. If you do those two things, we can really connect for the right reasons and impact in the right ways with the individuals that we come into contact with every single day.
I will give one other piece of advice. If you ever get the chance to present with Lisa Fine, take the opportunity. At some point, I will get to present with Lisa Beth and Eric at some point in the future. I'm just putting that out there. But Lisa was so much fun.
We're doing
and
it
so
now.
knowledgeable. We're doing it now. But again, we're going to do an encore. So it's all good.
We had a question which mentioned those three letters that Adam already mentioned earlier, E, S, and G. The question was, any sessions honing in on ESG and compliance's role? ESG was all over the agenda this year, as it has been, I think, the last couple of years. Guys, what do you think about the sort of evolution of ESG and the ESG discussion that you saw at SCCE this year?
Well, I will jump in on that because I think everybody knows that I am a big ESG proponent. I've done work in ESG for well over a decade and a half now. But this year we had a separate track. And one of the things that was really, really nice is that instead of having ESG sprinkled everywhere like your favorite hot sauce, it was really a little bit more defined, a little bit more mature. And I think that that is something that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. And the SCCE has an entire ESG conference coming up. I believe it's on December 1st. And they've been hosting those virtually for about the last year and a half. So I think there's going to be a lot to talk about in there, and they have a whole spectrum of topics outside of just what the role for compliance is.
Yeah, I felt last year and maybe I was just unprepared, but I was expecting some other topics were going to come up last year. I really thought like Activision Blizzard was going to be the topic of last year. It really wasn't. And I felt last year ESG was just in every single session, including one of the ones I was on last year, which was meant to be about ESG. But I did like this year that it was like Lisa Beth is saying, it was much more channeled. And I think it was much better. ESG still came up in some other sessions, but I also felt that if I wanted to go to a session on a particular topic, it wasn't that's just the kind of nice label, but then really we're just going to go into ESG. So I thought that made it better. You know, one of the things I learned actually, I think it was Christine who was on one of the panels I was on. She kind of made a comment. I think it was her. Hopefully, I'm attributing it to the right person, but reframing it in my mind of instead of us calling it ESG, it's E plus S plus G. And I think there's a lot of conversation right now in our profession about should compliance own ESG? And I think we have to kind of break it up into the different letters and see there's maybe some parts of it that we should own, but it doesn't mean we necessarily need to own the whole thing. And I think it's a really interesting place for us. Jury's still out for me right now in terms of, I don't think compliance should own ESG. I do think that people that do compliance can also do ESG. But I do think, in the next 5 to 10 years, and I saw an article about this the other day as well, which was quite encouraging. I'm hoping we are going to see the emergence in the C-suite of the chief purpose officer, who I really think is going to be, what is the purpose of this organization? How do we ensure that purpose is really, that is our constitution. That is what drives every single thing that we do in our organization. And I'm hoping that will pick up ethics and integrity, which is kind of my preference to ethics and compliance. I'm hoping it'll pick up, sustainability. It'll pick up some of ESG, DE&I, and maybe even some parts of HR as well, and really bringing those things together, kind of the purpose for employees, the purpose to, the outside world as well. And so I think that's where we need to go. And so I think, the next few years, continuing to really explore, what is E plus S plus G, where does it make sense in different organizations? And then what are we going to see with some compliance violations in the next few years? Are we going to see some companies where maybe the regulators are saying, you were so stretched thin and you had such a broad portfolio that's an issue? So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the next few years, but I think it's good to have the conversations and really for us to be intentional about what's our role individually and certainly as a profession.
Yeah, I on that last point, I do fear that this is getting added to an already packed agenda for a lot of compliance officers. But I do like the notion that you mentioned that maybe it's not all parts of this, but maybe it's the governance piece. For those of us who've been around for a while, we remember GRC when it was governance, risk, and compliance. So governance is maybe a more natural component. I don't know, depending on the organization and the history of what the compliance office has been responsible for. But maybe it's not everything. Maybe you get offered the whole plate and you say, I'm sorry, but I can only digest this part, and because that's the fear, right? Is that an already stretched organization with low FTE is not going to be able to properly manage this. As far as the sessions went, I think I attended 3 that had either was the primary component was ESG, or ESG was a significant piece, and I felt like they're getting more practical than the ESG sessions last year. And then I went to another event, which I won't be specific about, but I went to another event earlier this year where it was still very blue sky, talking about ESG. And I don't know, one of the things that I think is true about this audience, and I imagine most of you agree out there, is the reason we like going to SCCE is because it's practical. And it's, there's an occasional consultant like myself that gets thrown in the mix, but for the most part, it's practitioners and in-house folks like Adam who are doing the presentation. So it's very practical and experiential. And one of the sessions in particular was about how you handle due diligence and ongoing relationships with your third parties in the regarding ESG and the requirements that you need your third parties to adhere to on that front. And I thought that was really helpful because it not only talked about how you might solicit the data and information you need from third parties, but it dovetailed with third-party risk management, which is another important issue that most organizations are dealing with. So I felt it was much more practical this year, I guess.
I think you're very right on that, but I think there's actually 2 phenomena that are lending themselves to what's happening and kind of the maturation of this. And I think it's very similar to the maturation we saw in compliance, honestly, and continue to see. Number one, I think that there's a lot more regulation, and regulations, like, they can come home, right? Like we love our regulations. We get that. So as there are more specific requirements, either because of regulators in the area or because of volunteering your organization to comply with certain standards, I think that's where some of that maturation comes in. And then the second phenomenon that has been really changing the level of discussion is enforcement. Right, it changed the way that we talk about compliance, and it continues to, whether it's the Monaco memo or something else. Right, these are the things that generate real tactical, practical discussions. And what we're seeing in the ESG, and where I think that this kind of comes to a head for compliance professionals and ethics professionals, is they're using old standards and old theories of enforcement to apply to new areas like ESG, like cryptocurrency, like a whole bunch of other areas. So I think what you're going to see is very likely a lot of fraud prosecutions. You're seeing that in the securities world. You're seeing it with the Advertising Standards Association in the UK. And so when you have that beautiful, I mean, for me, it's beautiful because it really does make it practical and it matures up the practice, but also terrifying confluence of both regulatory action as well as enforcement and prosecution. That's where we get really serious really fast. And we start to say, how do we solve for this, rather than theoretically, wouldn't it be nice?
Yeah. Lisa Beth, is that the prosecution theory that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail?
A little bit. But it's amazing when you talk about fraud, there's nails everywhere.
No, I think that's true. It takes time, right? It takes time for the fraud section in the various U.S. attorneys' offices and the trial attorneys at the SEC and the various other agencies to get up to speed on what this looks like. And then if they're going to issue new rules from the SEC or elsewhere, it takes time to figure out what that's going to look like. So and it's been a while since I have seen these metrics, but it used to be DOJ used to talk about the average length of a investigation and prosecution for one of these fraud cases, and it's like 5 to 7 years. So you got to figure there's some lag time between when they first start investigating. So a new rule gets promulgated, they're going to start looking into reporting around ESG, whatever, however or whatever it is that they're investigating. So that's, in 2022, it could be, 2027, 2029 before those cases actually, hit the papers and become cases. So that's something else to consider. There is a lag time.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of ESG and sustainability feels very new to companies, but I think some of the existing rules could definitely trip people up, and it's something I'd like to see, frankly, discussed in more detail in some of the future sessions. But what about antitrust and ESG? There's a risk, right? There's lots of collaboration. There's lots of ideas that people are wanting to do, and I think when you've got great intention and an energy to move forward quickly, and there's social pressures, yeah, things that people are going to run, and are, how do you make sure that whether or not ethics and compliance owns ESG or whatever their relationship is to it, you got to make sure what's happening, and that good intentions have kind of good impacts, because it is going to be, I think, interesting to see what we see in the next few years, either new rules, new regulations, or people just tripping up badly over existing rules and not even thinking about, well, I was trying to do good. How can you tell me this is a violation of antitrust laws? We're going to be sitting there saying, yeah, no, it's you are trying to do good, and you clearly tripped up over these antitrust laws. So definitely be an interesting area to see. I will say, Eric, I also agree with you about the practical aspects of the training. I love hearing from other in-house professionals. I feel though at times for me, it's I see the world through my organization. And so it's hearing from those different perspectives, hearing from, outside counsel, hearing from people like yourself and Lisa Beth. You've got a broader perspective. And so I think that's really useful in the sessions, and also just the networking. Like even before this, I was asking you both, hey, what are you seeing on a particular topic? So you kind of have to zoom in and zoom out. And I think that's really what I like. I didn't feel there was a huge amount of regulator appearances this year. There was only 1 or 2 sessions, and I felt that was a little bit missing in a sense.
That was the next thing I was going to bring up, is the government involvement. I come from, before I took my left turn into compliance 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, however long it's been, I almost exclusively attended ABA and other legal focused events. And you get a lot of government participation in that situation. It's, always, almost every panel, you're going to have a prosecutor or trial attorney or regulator. But it does seem like, and we've always had that at SCCE, but it does seem like their participation was thin this year, even compared to past years. Thoughts on hearing from the Oracle this year?
I do think it's a lot easier to attract and have government officials when you're in Washington, D.C. area,
Yeah.
or like in a New York. It's much easier. The events that I've been to throughout the last year where there has been government participation, it has typically been virtual or not at all. So I'm presuming that there's probably some limits on travel and things like that. And there certainly are limits on what an organization can do to transport a government official to an event. So I think that there's a lot of that going on, but also a really rigorous regulatory and prosecutorial agenda. So I think that probably some of this is about timing and about accessibility in terms of the location and things like that more than anything. But I always think it's interesting to hear from the regulators and have government officials. And also, like, I typically don't take as much away in terms of what I can do better and how when there are prepared speeches like that.
Well, yeah, and you always get the caveat, right? I'm here, expressing my personal opinion. This does not binding on the U.S. government or my agency in any way whatsoever. So be forewarned. Yeah, but even though we didn't see, there was some participation in the one of the antitrust sessions with some folks from the antitrust division. But even though they weren't there, and even though Monaco wasn't there, her most recent memoranda was certainly a topic of conversation. For those of you who don't know, I want to say it came out about 6 weeks ago, something like that. Lisa Monaco, who's I'm going to get her title wrong, but I believe she is the assistant attorney general. She's either assistant or associate attorney general for the criminal division of Department of Justice. She has made a couple of speeches, but also has there's a memo with her name attached that's talked about the department's renewed effort to go after corporate malfeasance. Compliance gets a couple mentions in there. Incentives get a specific mention in that memoranda, which was nice to see, because I know many compliance officers still have a struggle in convincing their stakeholders that incentivizing compliance is important. So there's some interesting things in that memo. Thoughts about that discussion that went on, guys?
I will say we might have attended some different sessions. I didn't actually think it got as much airtime as I was expecting. And so yeah, we just attended different sessions, which in some ways I feel a little bit like what Lisa Beth said, that sometimes like we hear a speech and it's like, this changes everything. And even, Lisa Monaco's recent speech is like, this is not business as usual. And I read it, and I read it again. I was like, this is not transformational change. This is incremental change, right? Big fines, big penalties, going after individuals. The one thing, and I am speaking of my own individual personal opinion here, Ari, just to kind of borrow their approach here. But one of the things I actually felt was that I felt we had at SCCE was the focus on people. And I felt with some of Lisa Monaco's recent comments, it was like, well, the company, the wrongdoers should be the ones who pay. We should protect the shareholders from having to foot the wrongdoing. I'm like, what about all the innocent people who are harmed by compliance wrongdoings, either directly harmed or, we had Olga Pontus speak several years ago at one of the events in DC, and she shared that Odebrecht went from 168,000 employees in 2014 to less than 50,000 by 2018. I think we need the government to frankly see and tell those stories more. I think some of the government people who write some of the press releases do a phenomenal job. They are unsung heroes in my mind. Some of the DOJ press releases just telling that human story. But I feel that's something I really want to see more. Tell the human story and make sure that happens.
Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, like, I agree. Having lived through Enron and WorldCom and Arthur Andersen, I remember, like, I was at the SEC at the time, and one of my dear friends, who's still a dear friend, was basically on kind of loan for a 2-year stint from Arthur Andersen. And I mean, beyond having some of their, clear accounting issues with some of their offices, this was a broad organization that completely crumbled and disintegrated. And I had friends that I was, business school classmates with who had, taken their job at Arthur Andersen, and then like entire families were out of both incomes oftentimes. So you're right. There is a clear, impact when an organization is dinged, and going after the individuals. It seems like a lot of times the individuals who are really the bad actors, they find scapegoats that are lower in the organization, whether it's, the CFO finding investor relations professionals who should be the ones that the government's looking at, or the CEO who like says, oh, this was some underling who is really responsible for it, and they get off the hook because they've got good attorneys and other things. But there is I think more to the dialogue than just like, this is a new day. It's not really a new day, it's an incremental change, and there are some realistic outcomes that will happen from that that may be unintended consequences that we need to continue to talk about.
Yeah. And I think there's also the sort of danger for those of us who've been around long enough. There's the danger of sort of the agency who cries wolf, because we had the Yates memo a few years ago, and we've had these sorts of pronouncements before, maybe not quite as detailed. So maybe we're getting better because we're getting more detail about things like incentives, which they didn't ever talk about specifically before in this context. But I think there's that danger too, that somehow people are going to just not pay much attention to it because we've heard it before, and so it's business as usual. Yeah. So we're getting towards the end here, and we had a couple of questions, guys. So I want to go ahead and pose these to you. Joe had a question about sessions or thoughts on artificial intelligence and the need for careful handling and adherence to ethical principles. That's a good one. I am trying to, I don't think that I attended any sessions that talked about AI and AI ethics. I can't say for sure whether that was on the agenda or not. Guys, was that something that came up in any of your sessions or your discussions while you were at SCCE?
Yeah, there's some of that. I think that most of it is happening in more of the privacy-oriented discussions rather than separate and apart, just talking about ethical principles not tied to privacy. But that is something that I think there's going to be a lot of work on over the next couple of years. I think organizations are going to be particularly attuned to some of the issues around bias and kind of syndicated poor outcomes when it comes to artificial intelligence, because that is one of the real risks. And there's been a long discussion around the ethical principles behind different formulas, different algorithms, etc. I think that that's an area where we could absolutely, be better educated, more aware as consumers and as professionals.
Yeah, I will say this year I didn't feel there was a whole lot of discussion about the use of artificial intelligence. I feel like it's come up in the past. But I do like the point about the question about the need to be careful with handling, ethical principles. One of the points I did raise at the session, one of the sessions I had, and I feel this is actually going to help me as I've moved into more of a global ERM role, kind of really looking at, we provide long-term value to organizations, but I do feel like a lot of the time, it's like when I go trail running, right? I kind of tend to look down at the ground and not, so far out in the horizon. I do think in ethics and compliance, we've got to start looking further out. Like, what is the world going to look like 10 years from now? And I think we're going to see a lot more artificial intelligence, whether that's kind of built into our programs, whether it's built into our organizations, or whether it's things like, driverless vehicles or just other technologies that are going to exist. And as these things are being created now, how do we make sure that, and it's kind of, I think, leaning more into the ethics side rather than necessarily just the compliance side, how do we start building that? How do we start having those conversations so that the technology, you can't stop it, innovation, you can't stop, but how do we make sure that we are kind of helping guiding them? So that's something I think it's a really great question. And I do hope it's, things that we can look at for future conferences, but how do we become futurists? How do none of us can predict the future, but we can look at some of the trends and some of the data and get a general sense of where things are going.
Maybe thoughtful futurists. Okay, going back to your earlier point, Adam, about the danger of moving fast and breaking things is like in this area with AI. I know the one thing that I've read about in the past being a concern is discrimination and DEI concerns, and using AI to sort through CVs and applications, and what's, like you said, Lisa, Beth, what's built into that formula, that algorithm that might have some bias attached to it we hadn't even thought of. And, are we complying with our principles around DEI and discrimination in how we utilize that? Because we want to use it because it's great technology, but what are the ramifications? I think thoughtful futurists maybe is the way to go. So, and this next question kind of leads into that very thought. Any thoughts on DEI and how it's being integrated at this point? What did you think about the sessions and discussions about DEI this year at SCCE, guys?
I thought there were fewer of them. There was quite a bit more last year, and I'm trying to understand a little bit of the why, and also what our role could or should be in all of that. I mean, it does feel like in many organizations, DEI has become the responsibility of HR. I think that there are pluses and minuses to all things. But I do think that overall, we're not yet having the conversation about how the expectations around DEI have changed the jobs we do. Because I will tell you, like from my vantage point, having worked with lots of clients and now being in-house, I think that there is more that is coming into the ethics hotline that is not necessarily focused on other parts of ethics, but there's a lot focused in on, I don't like how this person is showing up to work, or I'm not feeling safe because I heard this person cough, or, I feel like there was a comment made and that comment could be viewed as offensive. I think that we will need to have more conversations around it and around expectations and outcomes for what our roles bring to this conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's something that we absolutely should be looking into, and I think for us to hear, some of the bigger trends, and how we can be supportive of those. But I think there's a lot of things as well, just about how do we in ethics and compliance make sure that we are supporting them. Where can there be good alignment? Even one of the things I always try and do if I'm putting together, I like to include a lot of visuals in my PowerPoint presentations. PowerPoint is still terrible. If you type in, certain jobs, it's going to give you some stereotypes. And so when we're thinking about that, how do we just make sure that we're connecting with our employees, we're connecting with different generations to get those different perspectives, and really make sure that we are supportive of the diversity that's within our organizations and outside our organizations as well. So I do think that'll be great to hear more and have more of those conversations in the future as well.
No, I think that's right. We're coming rapidly to the end, guys. Any concluding thoughts about this year's CEI? Maybe things to look forward to in further iterations next year and beyond?
The one thing we didn't talk about, Eric, and it's really, really important, so I'm going to bring it up.
Okay.
If we go back to Phoenix, SCCE has to do a much better job of telling us when those chicken tacos are being taken away. That caused a disturbance in the vendor hall. Those tacos were so good and they just disappeared. So if Jerry or Adam hear this, please do rectify that for the future.
I think we need to say double the guac, right?
Triple the guac, triple the guac.
Yeah, that's one thing you can't replicate virtually, unfortunately, is the chicken tacos. You have to experience that live. So next year we're in Chicago, right, Lisa Beth? Isn't that right? So I guess it would be deep dish pizza next year.
Oh, I've got some good ideas of great places to go visit. But yes, Chicago should be wonderful. I mean, I think that's a great place with a lot of history to talk about compliance and ethics, right? Chicago's got lots of stories. And if you don't know much about Chicago, maybe you should take a little city tour and you can see, the Valentine Day Massacre area and all of these other things. But I think it should be a really good showing next year in Chicago, and a lot of fun for the people who are able to attend both virtually and in person, or however the SCCE decides to offer the Compliance and Ethics Institute next year.
We'll be in the metaverse next year, Lisa Beth, whatever that is. I don't understand that, but that's where we'll be.
I think we're going to have some discussions about compliance and ethics in the metaverse, 3.0, right?
Yeah.
But we go where people are.
Add that to the long list of responsibilities for compliance officers, the metaverse as well. Guys, I can't thank you enough for spending an hour with me talking about this event. I mean, your enthusiasm, I think, for it is matched by mine. It's always a great event. For those who didn't make it this year, I hope we gave you a little insight into some of the major trends. But hope to see you there next year if you couldn't make it this year. As I mentioned at the top, if you have time before you log off, if you don't mind taking our quick survey, guys, that would be wonderful. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone.